Welcome to Gospel Truth with Andrew Wommack, a teaching ministry that focuses on God's unconditional love and grace. And now, here's Andrew.
Welcome to our Wednesday's broadcast of the Gospel Truth. And today I'm entering into the last teaching in my album entitled How to Fulfill God's Will. And this is my third album talking about God's will. So we've been dealing with this for well over 2 months. We talked about how to find God's will, how to follow God's will. This third album has been on how to fulfill God's will, and today I'm entering into the last teaching in this third album, and it's entitled Hope and Imagination. And I tell you, this is really important. I have referred to this in a number of different things, but I've not really taught very much in depth on it. And this teaching about imagination could prove to be one of the most useful things that I think I've ever had to share with people. It's something that most people don't really consciously think about and understand the importance of it. But if you are going to fulfill God's will for your life, you have to have a positive, productive imagination. Now, when I say that, there's a lot of people that are put off by that, because most adults see imagination as like fantasy. But you know, there's a big difference between fantasy and imagination. Let me use this definition. I actually wrote this down in my Bible. Here's the definition of imagination from the American Heritage Dictionary. The definition of imagination. It's number one is the process or power of forming a mental image of something not real or present. Now, I'm going to be explaining this. Some people, again, think that imagination is something that's fantasy. But the difference between a fantasy is totally make-believe. There is no reality to it at all. But an imagination is something that is vitally involved in reality. Look at this again. Here's the definition. The process or power of forming a mental image of something not real or present. I'm going to be focusing on the not present part. In other words, not something that you can see. The second definition means creativity or inventiveness. The third definition is resourcefulness. Whether you realize it or not, an imagination is a vital part of every one of our lives. And I want to go back and tie all of this into Romans chapter 1, verse 21. If you've been listening for the last few weeks, I've been talking from that verse about that when God does something in your life, it's really up to you whether or not it stays current and whether it increases and even benefits you more with the passage of time. If things that God has done in your life seem to diminish over time, it's not because God changes. He never changes. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. It's not because there is an expiration date on the power of God. It's not because it evaporates after a period of time. It's because we do things that diminish and limit God's benefit in our life. And Romans 1:21 tells you what those things are. The first thing it talks about is you don't glorify God. You don't put the proper value on Him. The second thing is you aren't thankful, which focuses your attention on what God is doing instead of what the devil is doing, all the negative things. That's what we've talked about for the last few weeks. And then the third thing, it says that their imagination became vain. Now, I believe that there's a sequence here. These aren't separated things. There's a sequence. The first thing is you've got to value the things of God. And if you truly value God, then you will be thankful for all that God has done for you and all that God has promised for you. And if you do those two things, then your imagination begins to start working for you. But if you don't value God properly, then a symptom or a characteristic of a person who hasn't placed the proper value on the things of God is that they will not be thankful. They will focus on all of the negative things that haven't happened instead of all of the good things that God has done. And if you don't value God, if you aren't thankful, then automatically your imagination becomes vain. Now, when it says vain, that doesn't mean that it quits working. It just means that it starts working against you instead of for you. Now, that is a major point right here. Whether you realize it or not, some of you listening to this program are probably thinking, man, I don't deal in this imagination stuff. You can't think without your imagination. Did you know you couldn't get home today? Let's say that you're at work. Let's say that you're on a vacation, you're someplace else. You can't get home without an imagination. Now, some people don't look at it that way. They look at this as, again, fantasy. But imagination is just your ability to picture or see something that isn't present. Like right now, if I was to ask you, how many doors do you have in your house? You know, some of you are right now at home watching this. Some of you are watching on your computer. There's different ways that people get hold of this program. But right now, you wouldn't be able to walk, or you probably live in a place that you can't see every door in your house from where you are at this time. And yet, you could tell me how many doors you have in your house. And yet, you've probably never sat down and just counted them out. You probably don't have just a figure stored in your head. What you would have to do is use your imagination, and you would sit right where you are, and you might be able to see one door or two doors to your house. But you know what? If you could sit there in your imagination, you would picture every one of those doors. Or here's another thing maybe that you could relate to. Let's talk about the house that you grew up in. And again, some people have trouble with this because you lived in so many different houses that it's hard for you to pick out one. But like in my case, from the time I was 2 years old until I married and left home, we lived in one house. And you know what? I can picture that house right now. And if you were to say, how many doors did you have in that house? I've never sat down and just counted them, but you know, I could sit there and in my imagination, I can go through that house and I can tell you exactly what that house looked like. I can tell you exactly how many doors we had. I could count all of the windows because I grew up in that house and I was so familiar with it. I could tell you what our yard was like. I could draw you a picture of that house. And it's not because I have a picture with me that I'm drawing it from that. It's in my imagination. This is how you think. It's how you see things. You know, if I was to ask directions about how do you get from where we are right now to the airport, you know, in our situation right here in Colorado Springs, we are on Elkton Drive is where our offices are. And if you were to ask me, how do you get to the Colorado Springs airport from here? Well, I would tell you that you go out here and you go down Elkton Drive until you hit the Garden of the Gods. There's a light there, and then you go down, and there's one, two. The third light is Interstate 25, and you would head south on that, and then you would go down. And you know what I'm doing? I'm counting. I've never sat down and counted how many lights there are, but in my mind, I can see all of this stuff. And I can tell you it's 1, 2, 3 lights, and then you turn right and you go down here probably 10 miles, and then you will take this exit. And I could tell you and count how many lights and describe an intersection to you. I'm not seeing those things with my physical eyes, but I have a picture on the inside. If I can't see it on the inside, then I couldn't give you directions how to get there. If you can't see where you live, and if you don't have a relative, you know, it may not be a map, but you have a kind of an understanding of how to get there from wherever you are, then you couldn't get home if you don't have an imagination. When you make a grocery list, you know what most people do? They go into the grocery store and they start over on either the right or the left-hand side, and they're familiar with that grocery store, and they know that all the produce is over here, and in their mind, they're going through that grocery store, and they're going up and down those aisles and picking out what they need. And you're seeing this stuff in your mind. This is how your mind works. The point I'm trying to make here is that the Scripture says that if you don't value God, if you aren't thankful, then your imagination becomes vain. It doesn't mean it doesn't work. It means it's working against you. You will start seeing negatively instead of seeing positively. And as I start to talk about the importance of your imagination, there's a lot of people that think, oh, I don't need that. I don't use an imagination. You use it all of the time. You use it every day of your life. You can't get to work. You can't get home. You can't do anything. When you communicate and you draw pictures is what you're doing. You know, I'm a teacher. This is what God has called me to do. And I believe that by the grace of God and the anointing that He put on my life, that I'm an effective communicator and that I help people to understand. And one of the things that makes me an effective communicator is I use words to paint pictures, and I use illustrations, things that people can relate to help them to see and understand. And if I can't get you to see something in your mind, in your imagination, then you won't be able to retain it. If it's just words, but there is no picture to tie those words to, you'll lose it. I know that most of you haven't thought through things this way, but I've thought about this a lot, and I really believe that all of this is true. And this is what makes a difference between an effective communicator and an ineffective communicator. A person could be saying the right words, but if they don't say it in ways that help people to picture it and get a picture of it on the inside, then you'll lose it. You know, here's an illustration that I've used a number of times, that when I was in the Army, I was on a fire support base. Now see, those words, fire support base, that means nothing to the average person. Some people are going to sit there and think, fire support, is this like a fire department? Is this where you control, you put out fires or something? No, this is talking about that in Vietnam there were these mountains scattered around, and they would put this little base up on the top of a mountain, and they would have mortars, and they would have recoilless 105s and all of this artillery and all of these things up there. And the troops that were out in the field that were encountering the enemy, they would call in to the fire support base, and we would send forth rockets and mortars and different things to support and to fight against the enemy. So anyway, see, the word fire support base might have meant nothing to you. It still may not mean a lot. I didn't spend a lot of time drawing this picture, but now you've got a better picture. Your imagination can see it more because I've described it a little bit. Here's another example, that we lived out on this fire support base, and it was completely surrounded by enemy troops, and so we had to have everything brought in by helicopters, and they would bring us our water in water blivets. Now, when I first got to Vietnam, I had never heard of a water blivet. The word blivet didn't mean a thing to me. And to most of you, probably this doesn't mean anything. And so, if I don't explain this and help draw a picture in your imagination of a water blivet, you'll lose this. If you can't, it's in a sense like you have a picture, and underneath the picture is a caption that explains it. But the picture is what you will remember. And so with my words, I can draw you a picture of what a water blivet is. They came in 250, 500, 1,000, and I think 1,500 gallon water blivets. And it was actually a black rubber cylinder that on each end of this cylinder, it had a brass spigot. And this is where these Chinook helicopters would hook a strap onto each end of this thing, and they would bring the water out in these 250, 500, 1,000, or 1,500 gallon sizes. And of course, when they were full with water, it was full, and they would set it down. On one end was a spigot. We'd come and we'd get our water out of these water blivets, and as the water came out of the water blivet, the atmospheric pressure would collapse those things. And when they got empty, you would just have this black rubber just laying flat on the ground with these two brass things on it, and they would come and pick it up and haul it out and bring us in a new one. Now, that still isn't a perfect picture. I could spend more time describing it. But see, now you've got an image. When I say water blivet, you can picture something. And now you can retain it. And I can guarantee you there are some of you that 10 years from now, if somebody mentioned a water blivet, you would immediately identify with it and know what they're talking about, because I used words to paint a picture, and you have an image on the inside. It may not be perfectly correct, but you do have an image, and you can remember something that you can see. But if you can't see it, you can't remember it. That's your imagination. Your imagination is your ability to see something in your mind's eye, or you could say in your heart, that you can't see with your physical eyes. That's all that your imagination is. And you use your imagination every day. You use it to go to work, you use it to come home, you use it to go grocery shopping, you use it when you plan anything. You know, as I mentioned on the program yesterday, I believe it was, I'm in the process of building a tree house for my granddaughter. And you know what? You have to picture it in your imagination before you can build it. Like just a couple of days ago, I built stairs up to this tree house. First time I've ever built stairs in my life. And you know what? I had to picture it. First of all, I looked at the stairs in our house and I saw how they were built. Then I went out to this tree house and I saw those stairs and I pictured these things. And I sat there, and if you would have seen me building this, I stood there a long time and I was just looking at this foundation, this platform we had built around this tree. And I was looking at this, and I was looking at the high side of the hill to, you know, decrease the number of steps. And I pictured it, and I thought about this. I envisioned the angle. And you know what all that is? It's imagination. You couldn't build anything without an imagination. This is why that a builder uses blueprints. It's a drawing that gives a picture. This is why that when you get something and you have to assemble it, they will have written instructions to give you explanation, but then they will have a picture over here. In the written instructions, it may say attach A to B. But you know what? A to B doesn't mean anything unless you have a picture over here that is labeled, and here's part A and here's part B. You know the old saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words? All of that is talking about your imagination. Your imagination is something that everyone uses. So I'm beginning to talk about how to fulfill God's will, and I'm talking about the role that imagination and hope plays in that. And I've just been spending the day trying to explain that imagination is not weird, it's not make-believe, it's not fantasy. Imagination is just simply talking about your ability to picture something in your mind's eye or to see it in your heart when you can't see it with your physical eyes. When you use your memory, you are using your imagination. When you build something, you are using your imagination. You have to see it on the inside. And when it comes to fulfilling God's will, God is going to give you a goal, something that isn't present, something that you can't see with your physical eye. But you will have to see it in your heart. You'll have to see it with your imagination. And if you can't imagine it, if you can't see it in your heart, then you won't see it on the outside. If you can't see yourself fulfilling God's will, then you'll never fulfill God's will. You have to use your imagination, and there's a lot of scriptures on this. I'm going to be getting into a lot of scriptures, but this first day, I've just been trying to verify that imagination is not something that is weird, spooky, it's not fantasy, it's not just something that you encourage in kids, but as you grow up, you have to get out of your imagination and live in the real world. No, every one of us use our imagination every single day of our life. You may not use that terminology, you may not call it imagination, but that is the scriptural terminology for it, and it is a vital process, part of the process of you fulfilling God's will. You know, let me give you an illustration. I've used this a number of times, but to me it's a classic illustration. I was listening to a teaching, I don't even remember who this was now, but they were talking along this line of imagination and how you have to see things on the inside before you see it on the outside. And they gave a testimony about a woman, a pastor's wife, who had poor eyesight. Her glasses were so thick that it was like looking through the bottom of a Coke bottle. And even with that, without her glasses, she was legally blind. Even with her glasses, she still had poor eyesight. And there was a healing evangelist that was scheduled to come to her church, and she knew that this healing evangelist was going to want to pray for her eyes. She had been prayed for a lot of times, had never seen any improvement, and she didn't want to be discouraged again. So she tried to avoid this healing evangelist, and yet he cornered her and said, "I want to pray for you." And so she allowed him to, and he had her take her glasses off. He laid hands on her, prayed for her, commanded sight to come to her, and then he asked her, after he had prayed, he says, "Now can you see?" And this woman started to open up her eyes. And he immediately said, I didn't tell you to open your eyes. Shut your eyes. And so she shut her eyes, wondering, well, how am I going to tell if I can see if I don't open my eyes? So he asked her the second time. He says, now can you see? So she started to open her eyes again. And he said, shut your eyes. So she shut her eyes again, wondering, what's he doing? And the third time he says, now can you see? So she started to open her eyes. And he says, you don't open your eyes. You've got to see it on the inside before you can see it on the outside. And finally, she realized that what he was talking about, he may not have used this terminology, but she had to, in her imagination, in her heart, she had to see herself seeing before it would come to pass. And so this time she kept her eyes closed, and she just started praying in tongues. And she started operating in faith, and it took a while, and after a period of time, she told this man, she says, I've got it. She says, I can see myself seeing. And he says, now open your eyes. And she opened her eyes, and she was able to see, and her eyesight was perfect. Now see, that's using your imagination, and this is a scriptural principle. I'm going to be delving into this in a lot more detail. But you can't see something in the physical until, first of all, you have seen it in the spiritual. You can't see it with your physical eyes until you, first of all, have seen it with your spiritual eyes. That's your imagination. And your imagination is a vital part of fulfilling God's will. Boy, this is important. And yet so many people don't understand that what they see in their imagination, and let me just say this, that some of you think, well, I don't use my imagination. You do. It's impossible not to use it. You use your imagination constantly, but if you aren't consciously, actively pursuing to use your imagination in a positive way, what will happen is it'll still work, but it'll just work in a negative way. For instance, when a doctor tells you that you've got some incurable disease, and all of a sudden you start thinking about, oh, dear old Aunt Susie died of this, and you start seeing in your mind, you replay her and the suffering that she had and how she died of this thing, and then you start seeing yourself dying, and you think about your funeral, and you plan what your funeral's going to be like, and how's your family going to make it without you. You know what all that is? That's an imagination. But it's a negative imagination. And it's working against you instead of for you. You may think you don't use an imagination, but you use it constantly. And if you aren't consciously using it in a positive way, then it will just automatically gravitate towards being a negative imagination, but it will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. As you think in your heart, that's your imagination. That's the way that you are going to be. Proverbs 23:7. And I'm going to be explaining this in a lot more detail and relating this to how you fulfill God's will in your life. And I tell you, this has a huge potential of changing your life. This could really be a blessing. I'm out of time today, but we will continue this teaching tomorrow, so I encourage you to listen in then. And also listen as our announcer gives you some information about how to get this teaching on how to fulfill God's will, and specifically this teaching on hope and imagination.
Andrew's complete teaching titled How to Fulfill God's Will was recorded live at a recent Gospel Truth seminar. It's available on either CD or DVD for £16. This series is also available on DVD as seen on our daily TV program. You can receive it for £16 when you write or call. Or you can get today's teaching as part of the God's Will package, which includes 3 albums: How to Find God's Will, How to Follow God's Will, and How to Fulfill God's Will. As a bonus, the package includes the Destiny Stories DVD, highlighting 4 stories of people whose lives were transformed as they pursued God's will for their lives. The entire package has a catalog value of £48. But Andrew considers this teaching so important, he'd like to get it to as many people as possible. Therefore, he's offering it to you for a gift of just £40 or more. Remember to specify the CD or DVD package when you order. The fifth audio teaching in today's series is available for £3 when you write or call. But if you're simply unable to afford it, Andrew and his partners will provide this fifth CD titled Hope and Imagination, free of charge. We'd like to remind you that we're offering Andrew's latest book titled God Wants You Well for £8.50. Contact us today to get your copy. You can use your credit card to order resources by telephone. Our helpline number is 01922 473 300. When calling from outside the UK, you must dial your international calling code, then 44 1922 473 300. Helpline hours are from 7 a.m. to 4 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. Or you can visit our website where you can order ministry materials 24 hours a day, 7 days a week at awme.net. To write us, use the address on your screen. We hope to hear from you today. We'd like to point out Andrew's upcoming speaking schedule. Mark your calendars to come meet Andrew at one of these events and let the Word of God transform your life. He'll be in Colorado Springs for the Andrew Wommack Ministers Conference October 4th through the 8th, and in Buxton, Derbyshire in England for the Andrew Wommack Ministries of Europe Ministers Conference October 18th through the 20th. For more details on Andrew's next meeting in your area, call our helpline or visit our website at awme.net.
I'd like to invite all of the full-time ministers to join me on October the 18th through the 20th for our 2010 Ministers Conference in the UK. We're coming back to Buxton, Derbyshire, England, and I tell you, I always enjoy this. Bob Yandian is going to be with me. Charlie and Jill LeBlanc will be doing praise and worship, and we just always have a powerful time. I mean, this last year we saw some miraculous things happen. People miraculously healed, and the ministers just encouraged by the Word of God. It's always a special time of encouragement. It's a great location, so make plans to join me October the 18th through the 20th at Buxton in Derbyshire, England for our 2010 Ministers Conference. Walk in that heat, because I tell you, people need to know the Lord was pleased with His disciples in Philippi.
For decades under communism, Russia recruited Third World students to St. Petersburg to indoctrinate them in Soviet universities. Today, the students still come, but they no longer learn communism. They learn business, medicine, science, and law. Charis Bible College graduate Carrie Pickett has been there for 10 years, preparing these same professionals to return home with the almost too good to be true news of the gospel. For a complete report on this story, go to awmi.net and click on today's news feature. Invest yourself in Charis Bible College today.